want to do 4 things. The first, I just can't help it. I want to kibitz a little on some of the questions that you asked Brian and give you my 2 cents, particularly on the civil rights issue. The second thing I want to do is a very brief overview. We've had a lot of good, gritty detail. I want to just give you the briefest overview of where we are in the political and the litigation battle and where we're going to be over the next couple of years. The third thing I want to do is just lay out for you in hopefully brief form the argument when I go to Harvard Law School and the National Gay and Lesbian Journalists Association. What do I say about this issue? And finally, I want to talk a little bit, return to the subject of what's happening in Massachusetts and what the future really holds for us as Catholics and for other Christians and other people of faith who try to adhere to their own traditions in a post-gay marriage world. On the civil rights, first of all, I just want to say that if you want a good source for information on this is our website as well, which is called marriagedebate.com. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a little 2-page pamphlet that we helped the Witherspoon Institute prepare, or I forget the name. It was, somehow, all the people, the names blur, but it was those people. We think of this as a 2-pager for the pews. So one side is why marriage matters, the social science evidence on the importance of marriage for child and adult well-being. The other side is why not gay marriage, or a kind of summary of some of the concerns that we have if we go to gay marriage. There's also, if you're really interested in the scientific debate, a policy brief called Do Moms and Dads Matter, which I think really is a very good summary of the state of the 2 kinds of literature, one on same-sex parenting and the other on the family structure debate generally. When people ask me about whether or not, what do you say when you talk about gay marriage as a civil right, I say 2 things. One is that you do have a right to marry, but you don't have a right to change the meaning of marriage because you don't happen, the one we have doesn't happen to suit you. You don't have an individual right to redefine, an ancient institution, especially through a non-democratic process. The second, and maybe more importantly to me, is, I say bans on interracial marriage were about, which is the big analogy, right? Aren't you banning gay marriage? That's like banning interracial marriage. Bans on interracial marriage were about keeping 2 races separate so that one race could oppress the other, and that's bad, right? Marriage is about bringing the 2 sexes together so that we can make the next generation and those children can have their mother and father, and that's good. One of the things I've found is if you're in any controversial issue, the single most important thing is to begin by standing on the ground of the good that you see, that you want to defend. And what I have found surprisingly is, and as I say, I go all over, I make this argument in front of gay people all the time, is that even people who violently disagree and passionately disagree with you, you earn a certain, if they can see what you care about and understand that it is a good thing, even if they don't agree with you and how you balance all the arguments, there's an enormous amount of space created, and the amount of fear that we have of each other is lessened, and that's what I've always done. Where are we in the gay marriage debate? We have 1 state that has gay marriage by court order, Massachusetts. We now have 2 states that have civil unions, full marriage equivalents by court order, Vermont and New Jersey. We have 45 states that have clarified the common law and have a statutory definition of marriage as the union of 1 man and 1 woman on the books. In every other state but Massachusetts, that is still the law in all those other states, but it's not necessarily statutorily defined. We now have 27 states that have passed state marriage amendments, so they have constitutional protection for marriage. In the last election, we had not lost a single one of those marriage amendments when they were put to the people. We lost 1 out of the 8 in the '06 elections in Arizona. And I think it's a real important question to figure out. In my mind, it's an ongoing project of mine right now to figure out why Arizona, or if Arizona, why not Wisconsin? Wisconsin was the state that they had targeted 3 months ago, they announced that they put $4 million, they put the most money into Wisconsin. They used very similar sets of arguments. And in Wisconsin, they failed miserably. So 59% of people in the state of Wisconsin, a Democrat state with a progressive tradition, supported a marriage amendment that not only defined marriage as the union of a husband and wife, but banned any civil union as well. So Arizona is a basically Republican state, and we need to figure out hard and respond to this, as Brian was suggesting, with some intelligence, with some money to do some good political analyzing and be prepared for the next battle. But as I said in my recent column, one of the things you can learn from the Arizona battle is that you can defeat a state marriage amendment as long as you never use the word marriage or the word gay. Right? They just rigidly excised any mention of gay people, gay couples, or marriage, and campaigned on the slogan of "Why take away health care," which I think was fairly brilliant on their part. But that's what they won in Arizona. In the litigation, we had one state Supreme Court in Hawaii in the early 90s signal that it was going to create gay marriage. The people of Hawaii responded with a state constitutional amendment. End of that story. We have had, since Goodridge became the first state to create a constitutional right to gay marriage, we've had decisions at the state Supreme Court level in Washington and New York upholding the marriage laws. And we've had a sneaker of a decision in New Jersey. I want to say that although I recognize with Brian that civil unions are a problem, and New Jersey is the court you would have thought most likely to order gay marriage. So to a certain extent, I can't say I'm really happy with that decision, and I think it's an outrageous decision, but I was pretty happy to get at least that out of that. We still have only one court that have ordered gay marriage. There are ongoing battles. The next court that will probably rule is the Supreme Court of the state of California, probably the second most likely court to order gay marriage. And they already have, by the legislature, a full civil union equivalent in the state of California. And then we will move to a Supreme Court decision in Connecticut. I think we're still at the appellate level, but in Maryland and Iowa are the cases where there's a live state litigation right now. And frankly, if we get out of California without a court-ordered gay marriage, I think at the state level, I'm not that worried about what's going to happen, at least to the word marriage, in Maryland, in Iowa, and in Connecticut. I may be proven wrong, but this is a very surprising result to the people who won Goodridge and the movement that pushed gay marriage. They thought that once they had pushed through this barrier, that everyone would fold. You know, they really did think that, and they are incredibly angry and shocked at particularly the courts in New York and Washington for not ruling for gay marriage. So the federal marriage amendment right now is frankly dead. You know, we went from 48 votes the first time in 2004 to 49 the second vote, or 47 to 48, I guess, and now we have a Democratic-controlled Senate. So it's, for all practical purposes, certainly for the next 2 years, there's not going to be federal protection for marriage. As somebody who quit my job in 2003 to enter the gay marriage debate almost full time, it's not all I do, but it's almost all I do, right? I have to say I think it's, I'm more pleased than displeased that we have fought them to an intellectual draw and a net political win. I'm going to talk a little bit about Massachusetts, where I think Dwight Duncan's outrage is fully justified. But as we pause a moment and prepare ourselves for the long-term battle, I think it's also important to celebrate the victories that we've had and that we've earned, because that's where you get energy to go on to the next battle. Politically, you're going to continue to see states attempt to pass state marriage amendments. It's going to become more difficult for 2 reasons. One, the gay marriage advocates have responded to their utter defeat in the 2004, where they lost 13 state marriage amendments. The closest margin was 57% in favor in Oregon. They passed by massive margins. With political intelligence, skill, and money to figure out what kind of messages could help defeat these, and then they actually get a lot of internal criticism when all the things they said in 2004, don't write discrimination into the Constitution, showing our nice gay families, none of that worked. what worked is making unmarried straight people afraid that unmarried couples were going to be deprived, particularly elderly ones, of their health insurance benefits. And they just rigidly focused and poured their money into the message that was going to actually succeed. But it's going to get harder, and it's going to take more skill and more intelligence to do it. And the second thing is that we're going to start moving into legislative battles for gay marriage. In Rhode Island, in the state of New York, the governor of New York is now in favor of gay marriage and has promised to introduce a bill. The California legislature actually passed a full gay marriage bill, and the governor there, Arnold Schwarzenegger, vetoed it. These battles are going to take place on their turf, not ours, the places where we're weakest and where they're strongest. And so one of the other things I really salute Brian Brown for is for beginning to figure out a strategy of it for political effectiveness in the states where places like Family Research Council and Focus on the Family are frankly quite weak and have relatively little influence. They do things that do help, but they are not going to get us. The evangelicals are not going to get us there in these states, and particularly in the Northeast Corridor. It's going to be figuring out how to identify, motivate, and organize Catholic voters. And it's going to become particularly important in Massachusetts, as I'll tell you along. That's where the ball game on the litigation and the political battles are. So what do I do when I go into the public square? I'm a Roman Catholic of the fair Orthodox. I don't like to say I'm a good Catholic because I don't think I'm that good really, but I'm a reasonably Orthodox one. So how do you make, I think what stops people is not only fear, and what stops a lot of good priests from saying, they don't really know how to say it. They don't know how to explain it in a way that makes sense to people who disagree with them. And one of the advantages I have in this is that I've been involved in the marriage debate for 20 years. I mean, it had nothing to do with gay marriage. It was focused on our high rates of family fragmentation, unmarried childbearing and divorce. And were we happy living in a society where every year more and more of our children were growing up in fatherless homes? Right? Or would we like to try to do something about that? So for years, I ignored the gay marriage issue. First of all, I just thought there were some arguments so dumb you didn't have to address them. That turns out not to be true. Secondly, I said in this, I'm thinking back in the early 90s, I said, oh no, you know, that Republicans are going to make this an us-them issue. It's going to be those awful gay people and gay marriage. Meanwhile, we're losing marriage as a social institution. And it's not a them problem, it's an us problem. In one way or another, this touches almost every family in America, and it's going to be a coming together, not a division, that will allow us to address it. So in April of 2003, for some reason, suddenly we all knew that Massachusetts was going to rule on this. Hadn't really been following it before then. And that we knew it was going to come down wrong. I don't know how we knew that, but it turns out to be true. And I was at a meeting of what, by that time, we started to call the marriage movement, you know, scholars and civic reformers and some journalists, people who thought we should have more children, not fewer children raised by their own married mother and father in decent, loving marriages. That was our goal. What were we going to do? It was a sort of strategy meeting for the wither the marriage movement. And somebody brought up the gay marriage issue, and we all said, as we always do whenever it came up, oh, no, that's not our issue, we're not going to. And I remember us thinking, okay, look, I know this isn't on our agenda, we're not going to be making any consensus statements about it this weekend, but, we're the marriage people, and they're talking about making this really huge change to our marriage laws. And forget about Pope. I've worked with you people 5-10 years, I don't know what you think. Shouldn't we at least talk about it? And so that made sense, and so because it wasn't on our official agenda, we adjourned, and then every single person went into the next room to talk about it. And Bill Doherty, who's a Unitarian and a family scholar, an ex-Catholic and a good man, quite a liberal, but very concerned about fatherlessness, suggested that we pull up 4 or 5 people to begin the conversation. Apparently this is called a fishbowl technique. And I volunteered to be one of those people, and he was focusing on what we think about homosexuality. And I said, Bill, that's not really what I'm thinking about. That's an important question, but it's not the one I'm thinking about. What I don't understand is how this institution can carry the message that children need their fathers as well as their mothers if we do this. mean, I don't know what marriage will mean if we go to gay marriage or to genderless marriage, unisex marriage. I don't know what it will mean, but I do not understand how it cannot possibly be about this thing. And this is the one thing, you know, that I've been doing, that we've all been doing this last 15 or 20 years, is focusing on marriage really matters because children need their mothers and fathers. And I left that meeting and I just started feeling really driven. But, you know, the reality was that the debate was being dominated by people whose primary concern was homosexuality or gay and lesbian civil rights. And that's an important issue, again, without prejudice to that. But we were really talking about, you know, changing marriage, which is a really core institution. And the people who cared about, who knew about marriage the most were just not involved in the debate. And so at that point, the Institute for American Values, where I'd been an affiliate scholar for almost a decade, just didn't want to enter the issue in a big way. And so I quit my job and founded the Institute for Marriage and Public Policy. And with the grace of God and the help of some people who saw a need for what I was able to offer, you know, we're still here. It's the tiniest of little think tanks. So for me, this is, let me tell you what this issue is not about for me. It's not primarily about homosexuality. And I mean that in a number of ways, but one of them is as I began to think, and you'll hear, about what marriage is cross-culturally and across history as a universal human institution, it became clear to me that our Judeo-Christian ideas about homosexuality are not human universals in the same sense. There are cultures that had different ideas about male sexual relationships than I support as a Catholic and that we have historically supported in our tradition. But what was completely odd was that they never confused these relationships with marriage. I mean, it is just a sign of something very deeply weak in our understandings of marriage that this is remotely plausible to any of us and to so many of our friends and neighbors. The second thing that it isn't for me is primarily about benefits. I do think civil unions are a problem. But I also think that the idea that there are benefits attached to marriage has been, in a legal sense, have been vastly overrated. No, there used to be a very important benefit attached to marriage. It gave you the legal right to have sex without going to jail, right? But the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, has created a constitutional right to sex outside of marriage, culminating in Lawrence. It's no longer the case that the other great benefit was paternity rights. A man had no right to the paternity and a woman no right to a father's support outside of marriage in our common law tradition. And that was overturned by the Supreme Court in the 70s. Legitimacy is now a suspect class and you cannot base any legal right or benefit based on the marital status of the parents. You know, and I like to just warn people that the gay marriage has been so successful at framing this as a question of benefits that I just say, like, you're thinking of getting married because you think the government is going to give you something that feels like a check, you know? Just think again. Yeah. Yes, there are some sort of distinct situations where a man might pay less in income taxes because he's married and supporting children. But in those cases, the wife at home is actually surrendering a huge and expensive packet of government benefits through the welfare system, food stamps, public housing, medical care, medical insurance. It's very hard if you just rigorously think about, are we incentivizing marriage with benefits? It really doesn't describe what the law is doing to marriage. The only ones that are really very powerful and distinctly benefits, that is, they help at least one person and don't burden the other one, happen when one of you is dead. And I don't think they're really the largest reason why people enter marriage. What the law of marriage is doing primarily is protecting the boundaries of a social institution. You know who's married and you know who's not. And that allows civil societies to do the heavy lifting in terms of creating young people who channel in some way enough of their erotic energy into this thing called marriage to create and raise the next generation. And the other reason I don't think it's about benefits is that I think that even if you could figure out how to give gay people all the benefits of marriage, we know that. This happened in Connecticut. They did a full marriage equivalent civil union. The next day, the gay marriage groups were in court arguing that that showed that marriage was just bigotry. And they used the passage of the civil unions laws as a legal argument for striking down the marriage laws. If you can, well, why call them by a different name if you've treated them the same? The gay marriage debate is about the moral narrative of marriage, right? Who gets it? Who gets to define publicly and in law what marriage means? This is the narrative that I think, the place I begin in debating this in the public square is to say, the very first question you have to ask yourself is, why do we have laws about marriage at all? Because frankly, it is not the case that the way we demonstrate typically how sacred, important, intimate, or socially valuable a relationship is, a personal adult relationship is to surround it with all kinds of legal regulation, right? In our tradition, it's primarily commercial relationships that are regulated by law. But in fact, this is the only adult intimate relationship that is heavily touched by the law. So I'm an aunt, I'm a sister, I'm the adult mother the adult daughter of an aging mother, I'm a best friend, I'm a coach or a mentor, I'm a godmother. These are the important socially valuable relationships, and they're untouched by law. So why is marriage the great exception? And I think, and the second place you go to is to realize that it's the great exception, not only here, but in virtually every known human society. Marriage is a virtually universal human institution, okay? Almost every society, there's a kind of anthropological debate about one or two, but virtually every known human society has something called marriage. And it varies wildly. I mean, a lot of weird stuff going on out there, doesn't necessarily look much like our own marriage traditions. Many of our ideas are just deeply and clearly rooted in our specific religious traditions, particularly male fidelity and monogamy, neither of which are remotely cross-cultural universals. When people say religion shouldn't influence marriage, I always want them to know if they think that the idea that men should be faithful to their wives is one of those religious ideas you want to rule out of the public square. I haven't had anyone take me up on that. But it has these contours. It's always a sexual union, a public sexual union, not a private or some other kind of union, between at least one man and one woman, in which the rights and responsibilities of the man and woman towards any children they produce are publicly and not merely privately defined and regulated, all right? So why is it, and this is really, there aren't very many human universals. I'm not saying that just because it's always been this way, you can't change it. That would be kind of an American thing to think, right? But I am saying you have to ask yourself, why is it in all these wildly, radically disconnected cultures, small tribes in the desert and in the jungle and in the mountains with different economic bases, really some really weirdly different religious stuff going on. Why is it that again and again human beings come up with some recognizable version of this thing called marriage? And I think when you think about it that way, the answer is not that hard to find. Marriage as a universal human idea is rooted in three enduring realities about human beings in every cultural context that they find themselves. The first is that the vast majority of men and women are powerfully attracted, and not by reason, to an act which creates new human life, right? Sex between men and women makes babies. The second reality is that society needs babies. Reproduction is optional for the individual, but it's not for the society. Societies that do not successfully manage procreation did not survive to be numbered among the human possibilities when curious anthropologists started going out and doing this field work in the 20s through the 40s. The third great idea that grounds marriage is that children need their father as well as their mother. And it is fatherhood that is primarily at stake in the marriage idea. Please don't get me wrong, there's actually a lot of evidence that one of the ways that marriage benefits children is that married mothers are better mothers. Primarily probably because they're not so overloaded as single mothers are. But the simplest way to put this in the way, you can get into discussions about patriarchy and gender roles and this, and I say, okay, let's just put that aside for a minute and say, when a baby is born, there's bound to be a mother somewhere close by. Right? If you want the father to be there too, there is some other process. And it's clearly going to be a cultural and social process that biology will not get you. Biology will do a pretty regular job of attaching mothers to their children, right? If you want the fathers to be there too, then something has to happen different in order to bring them into the mother-child unit. And the word for the process by which cultures do this is marriage. The idea that everyone should be married or every child should be protected by marriage, again, that's not universal. There are whole kinds of societies where they only care about the children of a certain small class of aristocrats, right? And sometimes you can think about where we're headed in this culture is becoming that kind of culture where a subsection of the already privileged experience the additional privilege of and protection of a married mom and dad. But so that's it. You know, some people are very kind enough to praise my intelligence and my arguments. I just go around saying really dumb and obvious things. Sex makes babies, society needs babies, babies need a father as well as a mother. But the interesting thing is that, in fact, all of these ideas are now under challenge in the public square. You know, we live in a society where generativity, for most of human history, generativity, you know, physically making and raising the next generation, was the principle of most institutions. I mean, kings had to get married and produce a king, you know, in order for there to be a king, or else their brother had to do that. Work was either, you know, family farms were passed down through families. Guilds membership was often passed down from father to son. The principle of generativity permeated the society. We now live in a society, which for very good reasons, by the way, the family is the only institution that's now dependent on that in any direct way. So I'm a Yale graduate. Yale doesn't reproduce by getting young Yale graduates together to make more Yaleys, you know? Congress doesn't reproduce that way. General Motors doesn't reproduce that way. And by the way, that's why we live in such an affluent, I mean, the wonders of the market economy, you know, the reason that these other institutions have grown and replaced a lot of what the family does is that they're better at these particular things. And if you doubt me, I say, well, I don't know what line of work you do, but imagine doing your work only with people closely related to you by blood or marriage, right? I mean, most of us would find it hard to imagine that the talent pool within our families would be sufficient. I know my brothers and sisters would find that to be true. But, so, you know, the wonder of the market economy is that we can pool our diverse talents in ways that aren't related by close kinship, which was the norm. But there's this one big thing that only the family can do, and that so what I've noticed, oddly, is that among elites, it's becoming very hard for people to recognize this. So I could bore you by going through, I just kind of monotonously went and looked at the social science evidence for all these points. The first one is worth mentioning, that sex makes babies, because I think I've thought about this. This really is a block to a lot of faithful Catholics. I can't tell you the number of places I go where there are lots of faithful Catholics, where somebody says, well, don't we have to first convince everyone about contraception? I mean, isn't that the root cause of this issue? And yeah, I mean, there's some sense in which that's true, but if in order to fight gay marriage, you first have to convert everyone on contraception, you know, I'm a pretty optimistic person, but I would just, you know, I wouldn't know how to begin to do that in the time frame necessary. That made me think about what I do, which is, and I'm just going to pass this on for those of you who are involved in the public square. I've just eluded the argument of whether sex should make babies, and I just point out that it keeps doing it, right? You know, I can't tell you how many conferences I've been at with middle-aged, particularly men scholars, saying we have separated sex from reproduction. And meanwhile, I'm looking around and the girls are still getting pregnant, you know? It's, and again, unsurprisingly, if you go and look for the scientific data, you find it adequately reflected. Unintended pregnancy is still a common, it's not a rare consequence, even in a society where contraceptive use is legal and common. 60% of women by their early 40s say they've had an unintended pregnancy. 40% of women between the ages of 35 and 39 have had a birth as a result of an unintended pregnancy. This is retrospective data too, so if you'd ask them in advance, you'd probably get a higher proportion. The Alan Guttmacher Institute, not our friends, the premier, publishes a journal, Family Planning Perspectives, premier scientific journal of the sex contraceptive scientific community. And you go and you look at rates of contraceptive failure, and there was a study of the National Survey of Family Growth, a large nationally representative database, which concluded that at typical rates of contraceptive failure, the woman who uses contraceptives regularly from her 15th to her 44th birthday can expect 1.8 pregnancies. So that's almost 2 whole people, right, as a result. 3/4, and if you look at fathers' intentions, unsurprisingly, you find that it's even more common for sex to make babies without any conscious desire or on the part of the participants. So 3/4 of unmarried births, a third of our children, actually 36% in the latest data of our children are born outside of marriage, and 3/4 of those births were unintended by at least one of their parents, right? So it's still perfectly rational for the state to prefer. The only way you can be sure that all of your children will have the protection of their own mother and father, working together, living together, raising the child together, is to first enter this kind of permanent sexual union that includes your heart, your sex, your pocketbook. Your pocketbook is very important. And that is how you can protect your children. Any other arrangement will leave some of your children vulnerable. The longer your non-marital sexual career, the more likely it is that you're producing one or more children across fatherless households. And so it's still rational for the state to prefer that people attracted to the opposite sex enter marital unions rather than other kind of sexual unions. On society needs babies, I'm 46, so in my young adulthood, overpopulation was the big issue. You know, you guys are probably aware, I'm shocked by how few people in the college campuses I go are aware that, you know, the United Nations is now issuing urgent warnings about depopulation in Europe. The European average fertility rate is 1.5 children per mother, per woman, and it takes about 2.1 to replace the population. This is a level that demographers refer to as very low fertility, and it threatens not only the structure of welfare benefits, but if it continues indefinitely, it threatens the very existence of those societies. If you go to 1 child per woman, you're cutting your population in half in every generation. Now, it takes a while for the older generations to die off, so you don't really see it or notice it that much until you start reaching the tail end when and moreover, you set in motion, once you're on that depopulation spiral, it's very difficult to reverse because the number of women of childbearing age gets smaller and smaller relative to the population. And so they would suddenly start having to have quite large families to make up the deficit. And we have never seen anything like that. So it still remains true, even though it's more difficult to see because we don't live in societies that are obviously reproduced generatively, that if you don't make babies, your civilization is not long for the world. This is important to me to point out because one of the things I say to gay audiences in particular, I say, okay, if I'm right, I know that's a big if, I don't necessarily expect to convince you, but if I'm right, it's not in your interest to do this, right? Because this is not just about the good people being married and the bad people not being married. This is a common good. We all need an institution that's about managing opposite sex attraction so that children aren't left abandoned and fatherless and so that we make enough of the next generation. And I don't know what Europe's going to look. It's going to be, from a sociologist's scientific standpoint, it's going to be very interesting when it becomes a majority Muslim society. You know, I somehow suspect that that society is not going to have the same attitude about gay civil rights that you would like it to have. And then the third idea is that children need a father as well as a mother. And I just thought I'd pause here and tell you a little bit about what I know about the social science debate. The first is that it was a long, hard fight that I was very much involved in the front lines on. I'm not by no means the major player, but certainly a major observer of the major players, to establish a consensus among scholars in the United States that all things being equal, children are better off with their own married mother and father, provided that marriage is not high conflict or violent. Before the gay marriage debate, by 2000, I could go to almost any university and I would find almost nobody who was willing, if you put it that way, to contest that that was the state of the evidence, and that was probably true. There are some other creative arguments about why you don't want to do anything about marriage, but that general principle was well established. I was very struck, and a few years ago I was asked to go to Canada and just kind of help those poor people trying to deal with their court decision on gay marriage. And they had to do a fight about gay marriage where it was not really accepted that marriage was an important social institution. So the social science evidence is the same everywhere, but it's only had an impact in certain places, and one of them is the United States. There is a much, much smaller body of evidence on gay parenting. The vast majority of it compares single lesbian mothers to single heterosexual mothers and finds no difference. It's just a non sequitur to say this data will tell you anything. I mean, you can't compare children in two kinds of fatherless homes and conclude you know anything about what it means to be in a fatherless home, much less a motherless one. That was because the legal issue in the early 90s was primarily custody for lesbian mothers, so they did these studies. There are now maybe 12 studies that look at same-sex couples raising children. Not a single one of them is based on nationally representative data. I mean, so we don't focus on children, which is a journal by the Brookings Institution and Princeton University, published an essay by two gay scholars, which after saying all the good things about this evidence and how optimistic and cheerful it is, conceded that we do not know how the normative child raised by a same-sex couple fares. I mean, and the striking thing is that this has made very little difference to child advocacy organizations, medical organizations. If you read their statements closely, they will acknowledge the state of the evidence and then they will endorse gay marriage or gay adoption anyway. So, but that is the state of the scientific evidence. In my view, we know nothing from a scientific standpoint about how children fare raised by two mothers, and less than nothing. There's almost no research at all about children with two gay fathers. And it's just a vast social experiment on our own children that we're conducting right now. So then the next question is, if this is what marriage is, and this is the reason, this is the public purpose of marriage, why we have laws about it. You know, if sex between men and women didn't make babies, I just don't think marriage would be a universal human institution. It doesn't mean if you don't have children, you're not married. It's not the motivation of the couple for entering it. It's the reason the whole superstructure exists. And it's the public justification for interfering in people's personal, intimate lives. The next question people have is, why will gay marriage change anything? So, okay, maybe this is what marriage is. Maybe why can't we just do gay marriage as a little add-on for Adam and Steve? Why will it change anything? And this is I've come to, I think there are a lot of reasons. By the way, if you want to access any of this data that I've just given you, also on my website, marriagedebate.com, under my picture, there's a law review essay called How Will Same-Sex Marriage Hurt Marriage as a Social Institution? And it lays out even in more detail the argument with the footnotes and the data if you need them for any purpose. Or you could just email me from the website and I'll answer your questions. This is what I say, because it's what I think is true. There are two big arguments on the public table right now. Okay? One is that there's no relevant difference between same-sex and opposite-sex couples, and anyone who thinks otherwise is like a bigot, right? The other is that there's something unique and significant about unions of husband and wife that justifies their unique treatment in law and society, right? These are fair summary. These are the benefits, all that's a side issue. These are the two narratives, which, now if we pick this narrative, particularly as a civil right, what is it about this that has to go, right? What has to go is anything that really is different and important about male-female unions, and in particular, the fact that these are the only unions that can create new life and connect that life to his or her own mother and father. This has to be either an unimportant idea in itself or no longer related, if it ever was, to our current idea about what marriage is for, right? There's a logical necessity here. If you're endorsing no difference, then you can no longer say that the unique things about these male-female unions are either very important in themselves, i.e. children don't really need a mother and father, any two loving adults are just fine, or the other argument that's made is that that's not what marriage is about, because infertile couples can marry, older couples can marry, so marriage is not about this. I know that it's true because this is the argument made. I know that a number of same-sex marriage advocates make the case for gay marriage precisely because it will destabilize and transform this archaic institution, and I agree with them. I happen to think it's a bad idea, but I agree with them that it will. I know it's the case because every court that has gotten to gay marriage has had to first dismiss, or in New Jersey, refuse to consider the idea that marriage has any important relationship to procreation and paternity, right? Or that we care about what family structure our children are in, or that attaching children to their natural parents is an important thing for the government to be concerned about, or that children have rights, some sort of basic human right, even if not enforceable at law, to the love and care of their own mother and father. These are the ideas you have to get rid of to get to gay marriage. The second reason I know that gay marriage is going to destabilize marriage as an institution is I just follow the logic of the argument they're making. The primary legal analogy being made is to Loving v. Virginia, which is the 1967 Supreme Court decision that banned interracial marriages. At that, not banned interracial, but banned bans on interracial marriages, struck down bans on interracial marriages. And at the time, the Supreme Court insisted that this affected only government action. So the set of government benefits would be available to interracial couples. But it took less than 20 years for that principle, that it is an unconstitutional discrimination to treat racially mixed couples differently from racially similar couples, to lead the Internal Revenue Service to strip a Southern Christian college of its tax-exempt status because it opposed interracial marriage and dating, it said, on religious grounds. Let me be clear, I don't have a problem with that on the racial issue. That's not the point I'm making. I'm saying, let's follow through that analogy here. You're saying that people like me who think children need mothers and fathers are like bigots who oppose interracial marriage. How do we treat people who oppose interracial marriage, not only in culture but in law? What happens to their institutions? How do we treat racists? Well, we don't lock you up in jail if you're a racist. You can be a racist in America. You have a right, free speech right, that's true. On the other hand, we don't let you run accredited schools. We don't let you have professional licenses. We don't let you run accredited university programs. We don't give tax-exempt status to your charitable organizations. It's against public policy to be a racist in America, and you cannot be a recognized charitable organization if you're advocating for racist ideas. It's a pretty serious indictment. This is what I've gone to where when I go to these places, usually when I speak, about 90% or more people are in favor of gay marriage, and I say, all right, you might think this is a great thing, right? But you can't stand here and say, I don't understand why anyone would possibly oppose this or think it matters. Well, you're also telling me that we're all going to be treated like racists in the public square if your argument is correct, right? Well, our institutions are going to be threatened. I have approached this primarily as a marriage issue. I mean, one of the ways this is going to affect marriage as a social institution is that the very groups that care the most and are most committed to marriage and need to be more involved in transmitting this marriage culture to the next generation are going to face suppression by the government. And a lot of good people are going to face difficult choices. Marriage is going to be a field you can't enter into because it'll endanger the whole rest of your charities. Focus on the Family is already finding this in Canada. They cannot talk about homosexuality because it will threaten all of the Christian, evangelical, and charitable work they do. So I'm not prepared to say that those are bad people making the wrong choice. If you're a large, complex organization like the church, fairly modest threats of something as big as taking away your tax-exempt status will lead you to self-censor, not because you're weak or you're cowardly, but because you have a lot of important work that you're trying to protect. And so I'm pretty clear to me that it's going to be hard to transmit the idea that marriage really matters because children need a mother and father if the people who voice this idea are viewed and treated as bigots in the public square. So that's why, for me, the gay marriage issue is just one when I entered in 2003, there were a lot of good people saying, oh, we should go on to the next battle, and I'm like, this is it. This is it. You cannot, if you can't, yes, it may lead to polygamy, but that's not even the main thing. Polygamy is a less weird marriage system than gay marriage. I mean, this is where we will cut the word and the idea and the thought. That's why the word actually does matter, from the sources of meaning that give it meaning. And in addition to that, Catholics, Christians, Orthodox Jews, Muslims need to be aware of the very real consequences. Conceding this principle that people who think marriage is the union of husband and wife are like bigots will have on their institutions and their efforts to transmit this internally within our own organizations. I knew this was true, and I was very grateful to the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty for gathering together a group of just top-level religious liberty scholars of left and right, more than half of whom were in favor of gay marriage, by the way, just to say, okay, if we do gay marriage, what will this mean for people of faith who oppose gay marriage in their institutions? What will it mean for religious liberty? And the results, which you can find on the Becket Fund website, becketfund.org, or on the Weekly Standard article, Banned in Boston, is a summary of this conference that I wrote. They're really quite frightening. And very, to the point where even a New York Times columnist who wrote about this conference, Peter Steinfeld, had to acknowledge that this was a serious issue. We're not dealing with hysteria on the part of a religious right. The conflicts are real, they're serious, they're coming. Mark Stern, who's the general counsel, the chief litigator for the American Jewish Congress, a pretty center-left group there up in Manhattan. I was sitting up in his office interviewing him, and he said to me, "It's a train wreck." He said, "It's a train wreck, and I don't see anyone trying to slow down this train." Back to Massachusetts, Mark Stern did a paper where he tried to chew through all the ways, can you run a Christian marriage counseling program and not counsel gay couples and how to keep their marriages together? Can you run a summer camp or a religious school and not admit children who are pursuing gay relationships? Is that going to be discrimination? The professional license issue. But the interesting thing is that he thought he had a pretty comprehensive list of all the ways in which this was going to impact religious institutions. He is an Orthodox Jew. He has a very personal interest in this. And the funny thing is that he never thought of the adoption license issue. But less than 2 years after the Goodrich Court established without any doubt that there is no place that you can treat same-sex and opposite-sex couples differently without being a bigot, Boston Catholic Charities was driven out. The government put the church out of the adoption business. It wasn't about the money. It's a felony to run an adoption agency in Massachusetts without a license. The state will only give you that license if you promise not to discriminate against gay couples in adoption. It's not about whether gay people can adopt. There's, I think, some 80 other adoption agencies that they could go to. It's about whether or not Christians, Catholics in Massachusetts are considered good enough citizens to help some of our poorest and most vulnerable children find good homes if they disagree about gay adoption or gay marriage. And the answer is no. The most shocking thing to me was the absolute absence of any give. Governor Romney was the only public official who supported giving an exemption to the church to keep Catholic Charities in business. Even the Republican candidate for governor said that the discrimination imperative was much more important. There are 3 other archdioceses in Massachusetts who have announced that they will not do gay adoptions. The enforcement of their anti-discrimination provisions was put on hold pending the pursuit of an exemption in the legislature, so now that they have a new Democrat governor there, I think you're going to see, the beginning of this play out. They will be, to a certain extent, hampered or held back by the desire to make it less clear to the rest of the nation what gay marriage really means. On the other hand, they're so dominant now in that culture that I think that it's going to be very difficult for them to withhold what they see they passionately hold as a moral principle, that you are a bigot if you think there's any problem with gay marriage or adoption. And all the good work that Dwight and others have done, we all owe them a great debt. The big hole is the one up there that I think that Brian Brown has identified. We don't right now have any capacity on the ground to make any legislature pay a price if they vote wrong. And I'm increasingly worried, frankly, about the church in Massachusetts. I'm no longer worried about, even apart from the gay marriage issue or the life issue, about winning enough votes to pass new legislation. I'm worried about something more basic. I'm worried about, I think that the task up there in Massachusetts is frankly going to be politically competent and effective enough to make it sufficiently painful to people if they go after the church that they prefer to leave us alone rather than to exercise their full powers that they can. And so one of the phases that we're in now is we've had certainly those of us in the pro-life movement have been very hitched to the Republican Party and very focused on the national gains we made. There's now a whole sector of the society where we are very weak and we have very little capacity to actually affect the outcomes. The church figuring out how to identify faithful Catholics organize them in a way that actually makes a difference is going to be the difference between full citizenship for Catholics and dhimmitud, which is the word for the way Christians and Jews were treated under Islam. You know, we won't kill you if you acknowledge our overlordship, right? And that you're second-class citizens. That's what they're trying to do, to drive us back behind the church doors as a new kind of closet. So on the other hand, in the long run, just to finish up, I'm highly confident that in the long run, we will win the battle on gay marriage, but only in this limited sense. I know in 200 years, gay marriage is not going to be the norm around the globe, because I'm just confident that societies that lose something as basic as that to make a marriage you need a husband and a wife are not going to be around in a couple of 100 years. You know, I know that I don't know how much persecution the church is going to face. I sometimes tell people, you know, they don't burn us as garden torches. We should be up to the challenges. But I know the church will be all right in the end because God has promised it. What really is at stake is American civilization. You know, that's really, and I happen to be enough of a daughter of my country to think that on the whole, America was a really, really good idea. To be grateful that I inherited it from people and to want to pass it on to my children. And that's fundamentally what's at stake with winning the marriage battle today. Thank you.